I used to think that loneliness was the most trustworthy friend I ever had. 9 years ago, when I first set foot in this land, I chose for myself a quiet life isolated from the outside world. Every morning when I woke up, there was nothing but the cold mist that covered the old forest. And every evening when I set foot, there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks of the door as my companion. At first, I found peace in that silence, as if it were a precious gift that helped me escape the hustle and bustle of the past. But gradually, that silence became an invisible prison, trapping me in a loneliness that I could not escape. I am a man who works as a lumberjack every day when I face trees, listening to the sound of axes hitting the wood, the sound of trees falling to the ground, and the sound itself has become so familiar that it is boring. Sometimes I try to listen carefully for the smallest sounds, like the sound of dry leaves falling, the sound of small animals running through the bushes, but all of them cannot fill the emptiness in my soul. Someone asked me why I chose to live such a secluded life. Actually, no one ever asked. But if someone cared to ask, I would say that I ran away from painful memories, from great disappointments of the past, from losses that I did not dare to look directly at. I left everything that could hurt me to return to the wild nature where I thought no one or nothing could touch my heart anymore. There are nights when I sit alone by the fire watching the flames dance on the dry logs, and I suddenly remember old moments. The crisp laughter of my loved ones, the sparkling eyes of joy that I thought would never disappear. But then they all vanish like thin smoke rising in the cold night. And I wonder, what is the meaning of this life when I continue to live like a wandering shadow, leaving no trace in this world? I tried to talk to the trees, to the clouds floating above, or to the little bird perched by the window. But all I got was silence or incomprehensible sounds. How ironic that I, the person who deliberately chose silence to protect my heart from being hurt, longed to hear a voice, even the smallest one. Many times I wondered if I was really living or just existing in my loneliness. I couldn't remember the last time I laughed, the last time I was happy or excited about something. I had forgotten how to talk to others, how to open my heart to receive love. Instead, I had built an invisible but strong wall around my heart to make sure no one could hurt me again. But the stronger the wall, the smaller and more lost I feel in this big world. I used to think that loneliness was the best way to protect myself, but it turns out that loneliness is slowly killing me from the inside. I am waiting for something to happen. A miracle, a small sign that can help me escape this sadness. But perhaps those are just the vain hopes of someone who has been alone for too long. Until one morning I woke up to strange sounds coming from outside the fence. At first I thought it was just the strong wind stirring the branches. But no, it was a faint sobbing, a fragile cry for help, like a thread being stretched and about to break. I stepped outside and immediately my heart sank at the sight before me. A young girl was tied to the fence in front of my house, her head bowed weakly, her long disheveled hair covering her face. I stood there motionless, my every pulse stopped, my every breath became labored. At that moment I realized something. I was not just standing before a strange girl, but I was standing before a destiny that was about to completely change my life. And in that moment I understood that perhaps life had heard the quiet whispers from my lonely heart. Perhaps life wanted to give me a second chance, a chance to heal and be reborn. But at that time, I could not have known that the decision to approach that fence would change my life forever, causing my long frozen heart to vibrate again, opening doors I once thought would be closed forever. Little did I know that she would teach me the most important lesson of my life. Lessons about life, lessons about love, and lessons about how to break the silence to live again. As my heavy feet approached the fence, I suddenly realized that this moment could destroy the peaceful life I had worked so hard to build over the years. But at that moment, curiosity and anxiety urged me to move closer. The girl's figure became clearer as I closed the distance. Her head was tilted to one side, her long black hair was messy and covered her face, strands of it stuck to the bleeding wound on her temple. She was wearing a frayed, muddy dress. Perhaps she had been left here since last night, in the freezing cold of the night dew. I felt my heart pounding, my breathing becoming more rapid. There was something that made me unable to take my eyes off this girl. I looked around, hoping to find someone, maybe a relative, a friend, or at least a sign of someone passing by. But no, there was no trace except for faint footprints on the damp ground, proving that someone had left in a hurry a long time ago. "Oh my God," I whispered, realizing that the girl's hands were tied tightly with thick rope digging into her pale, shivering skin. I hastily untied the knots, becoming more confused and anxious as I untied them. My mind was filled with unanswered questions. Who could have the heart to do this? Who was she? And more importantly, what should I do next? When the last rope was removed, the girl fell as light as a leaf, her fragile body trembling in my arms. At this moment, her eyes opened slightly, and I immediately recognized them with a shock, a pair of beautiful but empty eyes, seemingly lifeless. And when I tried to ask her if she was okay, her dry, cracked lips only trembled, but no sound came out. "Can you hear me?" I asked again, louder this time, trying to hide the confusion that was surrounding me. But instead of answering, she just stared at me intently, her eyes trying to read what I was saying through the smallest movements of my lips and facial expressions. Oh my God, I realized immediately, she can't hear. That was the moment when the feeling of pity surged most strongly in my heart. A young girl who could not hear, abandoned, tied up in the cold, unable to call for help, unable to even make the slightest sound. I felt anger mixed with pity, wondering how life could be so cruel to such a weak person. "It's okay, you're safe," I said softly, trying to use gestures to convey what I meant, hoping that she would understand. The girl's eyes briefly sparkled as if she understood, but the fear had not completely left her. I quickly took off my coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. Her body shivered under my rough fabric. I could feel the cold radiating from her delicate skin, and my anxiety grew. I had to get her inside as quickly as possible. During the short walk from the fence to the house, my heart was in constant struggle. I had never let anyone into my house in all these years of loneliness. This girl, a complete stranger, suddenly appeared and turned everything I had tried to hold on to upside down. But then I remembered the look of panic, the helplessness in her eyes as she was tied to the fence, and I knew I could not ignore the suffering of others. I placed the girl on a chair next to the fireplace, gently wiping the wound on her temple with a warm towel, feeling my heart sink when I saw the deep and swollen wound. Who could have the heart to do this, and why in front of my house, a lonely man who knew no one and did not want to get involved in the troubles outside? The feeling of surprise mixed with anxiety and confusion kept swirling around my mind. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know that the lonely life I thought I was used to had been forever broken today. But at the same time, there was a strange feeling of warmth creeping into my already frozen heart. A gentle, tender feeling that I didn't expect. I looked at the girl sitting there, the strange girl who had broken through my barrier of loneliness, and realized that from this moment on, my life had officially entered a new chapter. A chapter I was not prepared for, a chapter that I did not know where it would lead me, but a chapter I could not refuse. At that moment, when I looked at the strange girl shivering by the fireplace in my house, a fierce internal struggle took place in my mind. I knew clearly that this lonely life was not a coincidence. It was a choice I made to protect myself, to stay away from the pain that this life had sown into my soul. I was afraid, extremely afraid of breaking the solid shell of lonely safety that I had built. But as I looked into her panic-filled eyes, something strange happened. My fear and uncertainty were overshadowed by something bigger and more powerful, a sense of human responsibility for the suffering of others, a kindness and compassion that I had not felt so clearly for a long time. I walked closer to the girl, put the warm cup of water in her hands, gently helping her take it. Her small, trembling hands accepted the help, and I realized that her weakness was also the strongest call, urging me to act, to overcome my own fear, to do the right thing. The girl looked up at me, her eyes still filled with caution and doubt, but now a glimmer of hope began to shine in her eyes. Perhaps it was the sincerity in my actions that helped her begin to feel a little bit of safety, even the smallest. That moment made me suddenly realize that sometimes to do something good, we must be willing to go beyond our own safety boundaries, face the risks, the possible injuries. I took a deep breath and spoke softly to her, trying to use gestures and words slowly so she could understand. "I don't know who you are or what happened to you, but I promise you'll be safe here. I'll protect you until you're strong enough to leave." Even though she didn't hear what I said, her gaze suddenly softened as if she sensed my sincere kindness. At that moment, I felt a strong admiration for the little girl in front of me. She had bravely survived a long night of being left alone in the cold, overcoming loneliness and extreme fear. That courage made me wonder, could I, with all the strength and toughness of a grown man, endure what she had gone through? From that moment on, I knew there was no turning back. I had to be brave enough to move forward, to open my heart, to care for and protect her. even if it meant facing the painful past that I had tried to avoid for so many years. I began to prepare hot food for the girl, carefully bandaged her wounds, and arranged the most comfortable place to rest in the small house. These actions, though simple and ordinary, carried an invisible power, as if they were gradually breaking down the solid walls I had built around myself for so long. In the midst of this dire situation, I suddenly realized something important. Kindness and goodness always exist, and they can overcome any fear. The fact that I overcame my anxiety and was willing to open my door to a stranger was the clearest proof of the extraordinary power of human love. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes we don't need to do great or huge things. Just being brave enough to open our hearts and share kindness with those in need is enough to make this life much more meaningful. From that day on, my quiet solitude was replaced by the soft sounds of ordinary activities, the crackling of dry wood in the fire, the sound of the spoon lightly hitting the bowl as the girl ate, or the cautious light footsteps of her walking around my small house. I never thought that such simple sounds could make my heart flutter so much. In the early days, communication between us was not easy. She could not hear, and I did not know how to make her understand other than with clumsy gestures and the most sincere expressions I could muster. Sometimes she looked up at me with bewildered eyes, and I knew that she was as scared and confused as I was. But it was in those awkward moments that I realized something magical was happening between these two seemingly different people. We were learning to understand each other with our hearts instead of words. Every evening after cleaning up, I would sit by the fire telling little stories about my life with clumsy gestures. At first, she just silently watched my every move, my facial expression, as if trying to catch the smallest signs to understand the story I was trying to convey. Then one day she gently smiled and nodded as if telling me, "I understand what you are saying." At that moment, a strong wave of hope and warmth surged in my heart, dispelling all the previous fears and doubts. I realized that with humanity and sincerity, any barrier can be overcome. I began to observe the girl, more trying to understand the small, silent desires that she could not express. I learned to notice the smallest expressions on her face: a small smile when enjoying a hot meal, a hint of sadness when remembering something from the past, or a slight frown whenever a wound caused her pain. Those moments became the most valuable lessons life had ever taught me, lessons of sharing and true understanding. One day I found an old notebook and a pencil in an old chest. Carefully, I gave them to the girl. At first, she looked at me in surprise, her eyes hesitant, but then she quickly understood what I wanted to say. Her hands trembled, and after a long hesitation, she wrote down the first line: "Thank you for saving me." I looked at the words for a long time, then replied in my own clumsy handwriting, "No need to thank me. You saved me from loneliness." At that moment, the girl's eyes lit up with a ray of hope and intense gratitude. For the first time in many years, I suddenly realized that I was no longer alone. That strange girl brought a warm light, filling the void that I had been trying to run away from and deny for so long. In the following days, she began to write down small stories about herself. Through each stroke, I learned more about the pain and suffering that the girl had to endure, but most of all, the extraordinary strength and courage in her small heart. Those stories made me feel so small for the great courage that the girl showed, and I appreciated and was even more grateful for her presence in my life. Gradually, I noticed brighter smiles and warmer eyes appearing in my small house. We took care of the house together, repaired the old fence, and planted more wildflowers around the porch. My life seemed to be reborn once again. Old wounds, pains that seemed impossible to heal were gradually healed by human love and sincere sharing between two deeply wounded hearts. In this harsh and cruel situation, I realized that the greatest strength is not how strong we are, but the ability to open our hearts, dare to overcome fear, to share and accept others. It is sincere understanding that helps us find a language that overcomes all barriers, that is the language of the heart. That girl gave me a strong source of hope, a belief that no matter how cruel life is, no matter how hurt we are, as long as there is love and sharing, all good things will always be there waiting to bloom and spread. And in this moment, I realized I was ready to move on, to move past the fear, to move into a new future with a heart that could move and love again. Those newly found peaceful days did not last as long as I had hoped. I realized that one afternoon when the weak sunlight spread through the small window, creating silent shadows sliding across the floor, I accidentally caught her standing motionless in front of the mirror, her eyes distant as if lost in some painful memory. It seemed that in just a moment, the fragile peace we had just created was about to be shattered. I was about to move closer, but stopped when I saw the girl's hands trembling slightly. She gently touched the old wound on her temple. Her eyes flashed with terror, and she quickly turned away as if she wanted to run away from herself. At that moment, I clearly sensed a painful, uneasy emotion in her, a feeling I knew all too well. There were nights when I woke up and heard the faintest sobs coming from the corner of the room where the girl was lying. Every time my heart would clench, torn between the desire to comfort her and the fear of facing the painful past that I myself was trying to avoid. I could only quietly place a thick blanket over her shoulders, then step back, not daring to wake her up or face her. But deep in my heart, I knew that the wounds of the past could not sleep forever. One time while cleaning, she accidentally dropped a small bracelet from her pocket onto the floor. She immediately bent down to pick it up, but her movement suddenly stopped midway when she saw my eyes staring at the bracelet. In that moment, I clearly saw an indescribable pain flash across her face, as if she was facing something so great and haunting, something I could not understand, nor could I clearly guess. That bracelet must have contained something from the past, something that caused her such pain. She quickly hid it, her eyes averted, her small shoulders trembling slightly. I said nothing, just quietly turned away, but my heart was in turmoil with thousands of unanswered questions. What was hidden in this girl's past? Who had hurt her so much? The more I wondered, the more I was drawn into an endless spiral of doubt and anxiety. Then another afternoon, while I was preparing dinner, I suddenly heard a strange noise outside the house. Looking out the window, my heart suddenly stopped beating when I saw several strange figures approaching my house. The girl also saw them, and her face immediately turned pale, her eyes filled with utter panic. I recognized it immediately. These people were definitely related to the past that the girl had always tried to hide, but she didn't run away, nor did she cower in fear like when she first met me. Instead, she stood up straight, her small hand tightly grasping mine, her eyes no longer filled with fear, but with a strange determination. My heart was pounding with fear, wanting to pull her away immediately, but her next action completely stunned me. That small, weak girl suddenly walked quickly to the door alone, facing the approaching strangers. In that moment, I saw in her eyes a strange strength, a courage that I had never imagined she could have. I quickly ran after her, wanting to stop her, but her eyes looked at me gently, firmly, then gently shook her head as if to reassure me. Trust me. It was just a look, but it was enough to tell me everything. That weak little girl was choosing to face the past she had always feared for something greater than herself. I stood there, my heart throbbing with emotion and also great admiration for the courageous act the girl had just performed. The girl walked straight in front of the strangers, resolutely facing their fierce and threatening gazes head on. Not running away, not afraid. Her actions were the complete opposite of the first time I met her, a contrast that left me shocked and overwhelmed with emotion. She raised her head high, her eyes were as determined as ever, and I knew that no matter what happened, she would never back down. I understood that this little girl had found a reason to overcome her past pain, to overcome her own fears, and that was because of the love and appreciation for what we were building together. At that moment, I suddenly felt like my heart had regained its strongest vitality. No more haunting memories of the past, no more conflict in the present, only intense humanity, courage, and warmth remained. And I knew clearly that from now on, no matter what happened, we were ready to face it together and overcome it all. The moment the girl stood before the strangers, my heart was filled with fear. I thought that once again I would lose the only thing I had, the thing that made my lonely life so much more meaningful. But then right when I thought I was about to lose everything, the most unexpected thing happened. The girl stood up straight, looking deep into the eyes of the strangers. Her eyes now had no fear, no wavering, but instead were filled with extraordinary courage, so strong that even I was surprised. I had seen her weak, I had seen her panic, and yet now, before my eyes, was a completely different person. The man at the head of the group suddenly took a step back as if he was deterred by the girl's determined gaze. They looked at each other for a long time, the atmosphere as tense as a bowstring. I stood right next to her, my hands clenched, ready to protect her at all costs. But then, strangely, the man suddenly bowed his head, signaling the others to leave. Something like shame and remorse flashed in his eyes. Then he turned and quickly walked away from our land. The door closed, the girl turned to look at me, a smile of relief and peace on her lips. I was still surprised, my eyes questioning what had just happened, but she just smiled, put her small hand on my cheek, and silently nodded. At that moment, although not a word was said, my heart understood everything. She had faced and conquered the past, not with violence or hatred, but with courage, love, and forgiveness. All my fears and anxieties suddenly vanished as if they had never existed. I realized that I had just witnessed the most wonderful thing life has to offer, the power of humanity and kindness, an extraordinary power that can soothe and erase all wounds in the human soul. Since that day, our small house is no longer immersed in lonely silence. Together we build a simple yet warm life. Every day the crisp laughter resounds, the meals together become precious and sacred. I gradually realized that it is kindness and sincerity that have turned my seemingly dry and rigid life into a colorful flower garden. I am constantly amazed to realize that from someone who once thought I had nothing left to lose, I suddenly have all the most beautiful things I have ever desired, someone to love, a heart strong enough to protect and shelter, and above all, serenity and peace when looking forward. One winter evening by the blazing fire, she gently wrote a simple but beautiful line in the small notebook we used to share together. "Thank you for saving me from my own darkness." I smiled and wrote back below, "No, it was you who saved me from my own loneliness." The girl's eyes lit up with happiness. I held her hand, my heart filled with satisfaction. We sat there silent but understanding each other's hearts. I realized an important truth. Life is sometimes strange. There are things that seem to take everything away from you, but in the end, bring you the most precious thing. I looked up at the night sky through the small window. The bright stars twinkling above seemed to smile gently, witnessing the most peaceful and happy moment of my life. And in that moment, I deeply believe that no matter how harshly life treats us, as long as our hearts still hold kindness and goodness, then one day this world will respond to us with the most gentle thing. Sometimes we get caught up in thinking that life is complicated and difficult. But in fact, if we just know how to live kindly, lovingly, and forgivingly, life will be a little more pleasant and easier.